Hello, and today we're going to be going through my opinion on Ryobi's 4-volt lithium system and some of the pros and cons for it and against it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Now first up, let's talk about the concept of this particular system. This system is basically just utilizing a single 18650 cell battery in a plastic housing with a USB-C port on it. And for that concept, there's some things going for it, there's some things going against it. One thing going for it is you will be able to charge your phone without the need of an external tool. I like this idea, and I wish that they would incorporate this onto their regular 18-volt batteries, because this would be super useful, and a lot of other brands are doing it. So maybe in the future, Ryobi will do something similar. Who knows? But something that is going against it would be, well, unfortunately, it would be the price. Their smallest battery that they sell in this particular setup is a 2 amp hour lithium rechargeable battery, and selling for $24.97 for an 18650 cell battery. Now, maybe, 12 years ago, that might have been a fairly, reasonable price for something like this. But in today's modern world, $24 for basically just a housing around a single 18650 cell is definitely, a ripoff. At the very most, a single 18650 cell battery, like the one that you're using in this battery, is going to cost you anywhere from around $8 to around $14. And, charging an additional $10 on top of that is just not a reasonable price. So, quite frankly, I do find this to be a little bit irritating, and it's kind of a major turnoff, because if you have to pay $24 for a single 18650 cell battery, I really think there are better options that are cheaper that are around on the market to take a look at. Now, with that being said, it's not all bad news here, and I don't want to make it sound like that I'm totally against the concept of this particular system. I'm just kind of irritated that they decided to go with a proprietary battery. Now, the reason why they decided to go with a proprietary battery, one, it locks you into their particular system, so you can't buy other people's batteries, so it's to generate profit for them, which, their business, they need to make money. But it's also to make sure that people don't throw crappy 18650 batteries into their tools that could damage the tools, causing them to have to, pay out more warranties or, do more repairs on tools that, the fault that they stopped working might not necessarily be Ryobi's fault. So I can kind of see why they decided to go with this approach, but personally, I still would have preferred seeing an 18650 line of tools that just used standard 18650 cell batteries without the need of, the plastic housing. Now, there are people who have done teardowns of these batteries on YouTube, and you can go watch their videos, and you can see just what's inside the cell. It's basically just electronics here near the top of the battery, and then along the side of the battery, there's a temperature sensor as well as, a nickel-plated conduit down to the bottom of the battery so it can complete the circuit, and that really is about it. It might not be the most difficult job to swap the cell out if you know what you're doing, but if you're a novice, you could run the risk of destroying the cell because some of the components in there look fairly delicate. So, it's not something I would recommend trying to do on your own if you ever have a battery that goes bad, which is kind of the whole problem with this design and this approach. Because, unfortunately, TTI, Ryobi's parent company, now has a little bit of a record about, abandoning certain tool brands that are not performing well, or they just decide they want to go a different direction, and, you can just take a look at what happened to Hart to see what I'm talking about here, and why I'm still very salty about that whole situation. So yeah, I'm still not convinced that buying into another tool lineup offered by TTI is necessarily a good idea at this point in time. And just because the batteries are expensive, here's the 3 amp hour battery is $34.97. So, that's quite a bit higher price just for a single amp of, increased performance on a single cell battery. It's a very expensive battery system when you just look at the raw components before they've been assembled or anything. So, this is just, I think the price is probably the biggest thing that I think is holding back this particular system. But, the price of the tools also are not that affordable. Like, this USB lithium screwdriver kit. Yes, it comes with a 2 amp hour battery, the charging cable, and the tool itself. But honestly, $50 for a, screwdriver, an electric screwdriver or a cordless screwdriver, that's pretty expensive when you can pick one up off of, Amazon for, $15 that will probably have very similar performance. And, I've actually found, electric screwdrivers at the dollar store marked at $5. That's something that really irritates me, is the dollar store is no longer the dollar store, but, that's just the world we live in. But, I found them as low as $5, and, the $5 one was actually pretty good. And, I've bought expensive electric screwdrivers made by TTI. I bought a Hart one that was not very good, and, I bought other ones made from other brands. And I've just, I'm not always that thrilled with this power level of, I just don't think 4 volts really provides enough torque for a, electric screwdriver generally. There might be an exception to that rule, but, generally I'm just not thrilled about this particular kind of a setup. And, it's not just electric screwdrivers, they do make some other tools. This one's a little bit more compelling, or at least this screwdriver is. It's a multi-head setup. I've reviewed an off-brand one before, this one here, and it was not really all that great, and I didn't actually give it a positive review because the motor was weak, the cutting attachment was constantly misaligning and basically was defective out of the box, and it just didn't have that much power. And so I really wouldn't recommend this particular screwdriver at all. But who knows, maybe Ryobi can squeeze a little bit more power out of their motor and have it be a little bit more effective. But for me personally, I don't really have any interest in 4-volt screwdrivers, especially at this price point. You can buy a used drill at this price point with a battery if you look around, and quite frankly, I think $50 is just too high of a price to be asking for this sort of a tool system. 4 volts is just not enough power in my opinion, generally. Now, with that being said, there are some tools that can probably get away with using a smaller battery. This little hot glue gun probably will work just fine. It's not going to give you a very long battery life, but if all you're doing is some simple, craft booking or something, and you're not, at school doing hundreds of projects, this will probably work just fine. But then again, there are cheaper alternatives out there. The main difference in between, say, a cheaper alternative like this on Amazon and the Ryobi offering is the price, obviously, and also the fact that the Ryobi does have a removable battery, which means if your battery dies, you can swap it out with another one. But the problem is the batteries are expensive. So you can kind of see where my problem with this whole setup is coming from. It's a cool concept. I love the idea, but it's a proprietary battery system that has expensive batteries. And so it's not all that affordable for the everyday user. Now, I'm not saying that, you shouldn't take a look at a system like this, but there's a reason why, let's say the 18 volt corded or cordless version is going to be more attractive. It's because it can use bigger batteries, and the battery life is going to be much longer, so they can kind of get away with, charging a higher price for a tool like this. And I absolutely love my Ryobi hot glue gun. I think it's way better than any of the cord ones I've ever owned, simply because it doesn't fall over and get glue all over the side of it. So I absolutely love the Ryobi, glue gun, at least their 18 volt cordless version. So, I think there are pros and cons to a system like this. But I just don't see the point in paying $40 when you could buy something for literally, half the price. You can find them cheaper than this. And, it's one of those things where it's just, what are you actually getting for the money that you're paying? So, it's just, when it comes down to it, it's mostly about price. Now, price isn't an issue. There are interesting offerings. This little flashlight, I would never buy it. I think I would rather go with a different, I'd even go with an Amazon branded flashlight. These ones have been on Amazon for a long time. It doesn't have a charging port on it, but these ones can use, AAA batteries or 18650 cell batteries, and they've been around for literally probably, I don't know, at least 7 years at this point. So they seem to have stood the test of time on Amazon, which is pretty rare for an Amazon product. So I would rather buy something like this than something like this that has a proprietary battery. And if Ryobi ever kills off the system, or more accurately, if TTI ever kills off the system, then you're kind of up the creek without a paddle. Whereas with this, you can use, 2 different kinds of batteries with it, and so, it will last, hopefully, a lot longer. Now, I've never owned this one, so I can't speak to this one personally, but, it seems to be getting fairly good reviews. I would, however, highly discourage you from purchasing this Harbor Freight rechargeable flashlight, which does not have a removable battery, which means that it is just manufactured e-waste as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, stay away from this product here. Now, next up we have the little flip light. Now, this is one of the few tools in the current Ryobi lithium lineup that I actually think is actually worth the price that they're asking for it. It's very well engineered, it's very well thought out, and it is chock full of useful features. You can hang it on 2x4s, it's got magnets on the back, on the base, so that you can flip the light downward. You know, I did a review on this, and it's very well engineered, very well thought out, and I think that $30 is an acceptable price for something like this. So if you're viewing it as a single-time purchase of like a light that has a built-in battery and that you might never be able to replace, it's an acceptable price, I think, at this price point. But if you're viewing it as a system that might have changeable batteries, then you might be disappointed if Ryobi ever kills off the system. So, it is what it is. Now, it's not just that some of the tools are expensive, it's that some of the tools that were, very attractive at the beginning seem to be out of stock and haven't been restocked in a while, like this foam cutter. This is something I actually was semi-interested in, but it's been out of stock for a while now, and the price is rather high, especially for a foam cutter, and you can find, corded versions of something like this for a much lesser price. So, it's one of those things where it's like, do you pay $27 for a corded version, or, pay $100 for the name brand cordless version that if you can find it, but it's out of stock, so you can't find it? I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like, are you actually getting what you're paying for? Is there an issue? Is that why it hasn't been restocked? Or is it just because, it's a manufacturing delay or something? I don't know. But the fact it has been out of stock for a while makes me always a little bit suspicious. So, it is what it is. And then, of course, there's just things that are just unreasonably priced, period. The foam cutting tool is kind of unique, so I can understand why they'd be charging a little bit more. But a cordless soldering pin, come on. $70 for a cordless soldering pin is not a reasonable price, and I don't know what you're thinking here, Ryobi. If you were looking at, say, something from another brand off Amazon, Nico, they've been around for a little while, and their products usually get fairly decent reviews, and they're asking $26 for their cordless soldering pin. So, it's like, would you rather pay, $70 for something that has a removable battery that, like I said before, might not be around forever? Or do you just buy the tool that with a non-removable battery that even if, after 10 years it dies or something, you can just, buy another one for literally still less than what you paid for the Ryobi? I don't know. I think this is just unreasonably expensive for what you're getting. There's not a whole lot of moving parts in something like this, and they can definitely make it a whole lot cheaper than for what they're asking for here. So yeah, they're definitely got quite a bit of markup going on here. Next up, we have a cordless rotary tool. Now, this is a kind of a tool I would never have even thought about purchasing, simply because I don't really like 4-volt tools a lot of the time. But I actually had my mind changed by a Hyper-Tough gift box version of this that, you buy at Walmart during Christmas time, or, we buy at Walmart during Christmas time, and it's actually fairly decent. So this might be something worth giving a try, but, $60 is still pretty expensive for something like this, especially since, there are a lot of other tools on Amazon that you can find for a cheaper price that get pretty good reviews and probably offer pretty similar performance. But then again, I haven't actually used the Ryobi, so I can't speak to just how much power it has. So, one way or the other, it's an interesting setup. And of course, there are inflators. Ryobi has an inflator. It's going to cost you $42. Not a horrible price. But then again, you can still find cheaper alternatives on Amazon for literally half the price. I will say that, this one might last longer, but I've also had a Ryobi inflator die on me. And generally, if you actually look into the instructions about how long, these sorts of inflators are supposed to operate before letting them cool down, it's usually like 5 minutes or something. And that's a pretty short period of time, especially if you're pumping up a larger tire. Not that this is meant to pump up a larger tire, but, it's one of those things where it's just, I don't know, the price just doesn't seem to be quite accurate for what you're getting here, or, corresponding to what you're getting here. And then, of course, this is something I would never buy because these things are just gimmick products as far as I'm concerned. Desktop vacuums. I don't think anyone actually ever really truly uses these things, and they don't ever seem to get really good reviews, and they're always seeming to be discontinued and new ones showing up. I don't know. I don't think these things are all that useful personally. Maybe somebody likes them, I don't. And then, of course, the sprayer kit. This would be something I'd be interested in buying one, but, $50 is still way more expensive than $20. I'm not convinced that, you know, Ryobi will keep this particular tool lineup around forever, and so I don't know. I'm just not willing to pay that extra increased price. And then, you know, they do have, this is kind of a cool little light, but I don't know if I would still be interested in buying something like this just because of the price point. And, you know, there are other versions, although admittedly this thing looks like crap compared to the Ryobi. But, you know, maybe it's decent, I don't know. I don't own either one, so I can't really speak to this particular product. And then we have a magnifying glass. You know, this could be super useful and be very helpful. But then again, there's still another version of it on Amazon that looks like it has a larger area, which was probably going to be a little bit easier for people to look through, and it has fairly decent, you know, user reviews, although, you know, they could be bought and paid. But, you know, it does not use a rechargeable battery, it uses standard AA battery, so maybe for that rechargeable battery, it may be worth it. You know, I'm not sure. And then, of course, you know, we have a, you know, inspection light, or, you know, just a tilting light or mechanic light. And, you know, $43, not insanely, you know, priced, but you can buy a version of, or a light like this that just uses regular 18650 cell batteries. That is literally about the same price, but you get two of them plus the batteries. So, you know, I still think that, you know, Ryobi is charging a bit much for what you're getting here. I really do not like proprietary battery systems when they don't need to be proprietary. Yes, an 18-volt battery is generally proprietary for whatever brand it corresponds to, but there's literally, I don't know, what is there, 16 batteries in a battery pack generally for a 4 amp hour battery. You have a single battery in one of these particular products. There's no reason why you need to have, you know, a proprietary battery pack, other than, you know, if it's an issue with, you know, people scamming you through warranties or swapping the batteries out. So, you know, I don't know. I'm just not a big fan of this particular setup. And then, of course, you know, there are other options on the market if you need a work light or a waterproof light that you can use that costs still less than, you know, say something that has a fairly high water resistance. So, you know, like I have this particular version of the light. It has a different brand name. I don't use it for diving underwater. I can't speak to its ability as a diving light, but as a light to stick out in the rain or just in shallow water, works great. No complaints. Runs off two 18650 cell batteries. Fantastic. Everything I really need. The only thing I would change would have a rubberized texture around it to protect it in case you dropped it, but it's a dive light, so it's really not meant to be used for the way I'm using it. And then, of course, there are a few unique products in Ryobi's, you know, tool lineup, such as this little USB lithium auger. But, you know, this is going to be useful if your clog is really near, well, the drain. If it's further down in the pipe, it's not going to be all that useful. So, you know, it's a unique product. You know, $60 might be an acceptable price for something like this, but it's going to be fairly limited in what it can actually provide you with. And then, you know, this particular little light might actually be worth the asking price of $50. It has a built-in laser, the head is tiltable, and it has a clip and magnetic base. This might actually be worth what they're asking for it, but I don't own it, so I'm not sure. So, you know, there are some tools in their lineup that seem to be worth it, and then there are other tools that aren't worth it. And there, of course, are unique tools. Like, I don't really see anybody else making a product quite like this particular one. And $30 isn't a half bad price. You know, they say it can work up to 52 hours. So if all you need is a beacon light for your campsite for when you need to go out in the woods to do whatever you need to do, gather firewood or, you know, use the facilities, you know, this might actually be a fairly useful little tool so you can find your way back. So, you know, this actually, I think, is an acceptable price for this particular tool as well. And, of course, there are ways you can get some of the tools cheaper, sort of. This particular set costs $120 currently, which is not a half bad price. You know, that's about $35 per tool. But the problem is there's only 2 batteries included in the kit, which means you're going to come up short on batteries. You know, if it had a battery for each tool, you know, I'd say that this would be a good way to get into the system, but since there's only 2 batteries, I can't say that that's actually all that, of an attractive price to begin with. So, you know, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of the proprietary battery system, especially with Ryobi having, or TTI I should say, having a history of discontinuing tool lines that seemed like they were pretty permanent. And then, of course, you know, there are other past Ryobi tech or tool lines that were discontinued a long time ago. This flashlight here looks pretty dang familiar. Wonder where we've seen that before. But, you know, they had headphones that had a removable battery. That actually would be kind of cool to see, and would be something I would think would actually be kind of, you know, fun to have. The camera, you know, in today's world, not needed. They had a phone charger. The battery itself can do that now, so that's a good upgrade. But, you know, there were things that the old system, some tools in that old system that the new system just doesn't have. And quite frankly, you know, I don't know. I'm a little bit suspicious of TTI and Ryobi currently. And, you know, they've killed other, you know, product lines, such as, you know, the job-based lineup that you could is basically a tool that could have multiple head attachments, you know, like a reciprocating saw, drill, multi-tool, you know, jigsaw, and you know they killed that off. And you know that was across two different systems. It was across Rigid and Ryobi, so they basically left two different customer bases completely high and dry for that particular tool. It wasn't nearly as bad as the Heart kill off because you know they still make Ryobi tools and they still make Rigid tools, whereas they won't be making Heart batteries or Heart tools anymore. But still, it's one of those things where it's like, why do you do this to us? So you know, at the end of the day, you know, there are pros and cons to this particular sort of a system, but for me personally, I'm just not really convinced. I don't think I really trust TTI enough right now to buy into another tool lineup after several tool lineups have been killed off. You know, two fairly recently, one a long time ago, so, you know, it is what it is. I think there are definitely pros and cons to each one of these, but for me personally, I think I'm just going to stick with my piecing together of, you know, battery, you know, just my, you know, piecemealing tool brand setup of 4-volt tools. I don't think I really want to commit to just one tool system because of the price point and, well, the parent company. So, yeah, that's about it. And that is it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe. And, you know, it's a little bit different than what I typically do, but, you know, I thought it was worth taking a look at. You know, I now have two of the little flip lights that I reviewed, you know, previously, and I think they both work very well. So I'm not totally against this particular concept of a system. I just think that there are better ways of implementing it. So who knows? Maybe Ryobi will keep this system for 30 years. Maybe they'll discontinue it next year. Who knows? But at the same time, it's really going to be up to you and your own personal needs for, well, what you're, well, looking for in a tool system. So yeah, we will see you all next time. God bless.